Thank you, Dan, for that beautiful introduction. It's really nice to be here, partly because it's such a beautiful room and you're a great crowd. You were sort of humming like bees in anticipation earlier, and because Dan organises everything so beautifully, and because Kate is such a delight to talk to. I've interviewed Kate many times, and every time I interview Kate, I learn something about the craft of writing that is really, really precious and valuable. And also, Kate, this evening I'm very aware of the fact that you are a phenomenal recycler, because your knowledge of sheep farming has not gone to waste, has it? You learned quite a lot about sheep when it came to Elizabeth MacArthur, and you are able to revisit. Whoops, there goes the lapel mic, just a minute.
I never waste a thing.
No.
I never waste a thing. And sheep, I thought sheep would be the most boring thing in the world, but actually I kind of got interested. I'm very nerdy, so sheep became. I'm just vamping here while Caroline repeats things. There we go.
Excellent. Yeah, no, keep talking about sheep for a moment, because I am quite interested in. I'm interested in recycling, and I think in music we are used to the fact that composers can legitimately revisit a melody and conjugate it in a different key or in a different arrangement. But it's not something that we talk about very much in terms of writing. I'm wondering whether you keep a file of scraps or of things from one book that you haven't been able to use that you think might be useful in the next one, or whether it is the case that having become a bit of an expert on something, you just think, right, I'm going to use that again.
Look, to call what I have a file is to glorify it way beyond what it deserves. What I do have is a manila folder called Good Bits to Use Later. And when I have a draft that is clearly full of dreadful bits, I pluck them out, and because I'm calling them Good Bits to Use Later, I can allow myself to cut them out of the book and stick them in this thing. Otherwise, it's very hard to kill one's darlings. And the stuff about sheep, well, the occurrence of sheep in here is, of course, from real life, so I didn't have to make that up. But the background of the MacArthur sheep, I actually saw the MacArthur sheep. I mean, there's something quite weird about seeing the actual living animals that are direct descendants of John MacArthur's sheep. The sheep stuff, I think sheep are... I have a little hobby farm outside Melbourne, and I'm trying to grow a few native plants, but I also have borrowed some sheep to keep the grass down. And I can only say I've built many fences against these sheep. Never underestimate the intelligence of a sheep. So far they are smarter than I am getting through these little fences that I make.
We've got a slight whistle in the mics, and I'm not sure. Should we be closer? Okay.
Closer.
I'm going to go better than John MacArthur's sheep, because I can tell you, in all honesty, that today I am wearing socks made from merino from John MacArthur's sheep. Yes, absolutely.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I went to a sock shop which has that particular provenance, and I wasn't thinking of you when I made that decision this morning.
I am so impressed, and I will have to ask you later.
I will tell you later. Okay, let's just try and move a little bit up from the sheep and the socks to a more literary level of conversation. Your memories of your grandmother hinge on one very poignant moment when she asked you a question and you gave her a very hard, rather cruel answer. Can you tell us that story, and can you tell us whether, in a sense, this book is your way of atoning for that answer?
I think you've just answered the question, but I'll tell the story in any case. Yes, my grandmother came to live with us when I was about 6, and she lived with us for a couple of years in the granny flat at the side. Now, I don't remember very much about her, but I have this impression of a stern, disapproving... I never remember her smiling. You know how grannies are supposed to be warm, cosy, scone-bearing people? Mine was not like that. And the interesting thing is, since I've been writing this book, and people say, oh, what are you writing about? Oh, a book about my cranky grandmother. Their eyes light up, and they say, my grandmother was cranky too. So Just out of interest, how many of you in this room don't have the stereotypical scone-bearing grandma, but the cranky one? Ah, look at that! Look at that! That is extraordinary. So I think we need to shift that stereotype. So my story about my stern grandmother will not come as a surprise to some of you. I was out in the garden, sort of mucking around with dirt, sort of rearranging dirt, which I think I did for most of my childhood. So I was looking pretty scruffy probably. And Grandma came out and stood over me, and I have this vivid image of a long, tall, stern, dark, wrinkled, disapproving, she just exuded disapproval. And this person looked down at me and she said, "Do you love me, Kathy?" Well, I was a well-brought-up child and I had been brought up to be truthful. "Do not tell lies," my mother said. So I looked up at this frightening person and I simply said no. So, for many years I have told that story as a joke, and it is kind of funny, but I think it was when I became a grandmother myself, which is about 3 years ago, I began to look at that moment differently. It wouldn't occur to me to ask my grandchildren whether they loved me, because I think they do. But the fact that my grandmother had to ask, I suddenly saw that moment in a completely different light. And because I always start a book with a question, that was the question: how did my cranky grandmother become that way? And so yes, it is very much an atonement, or at least not so much an atonement as a desire to understand another human being. Yep.
I love the fact that now we've already got the knitting nanas, but now we've got the cranky nanas as well. That's a great. I think it would be fun to belong to that group of cranky nanas. Tell us a bit about Molly, because the thing that is the thing that makes her so fascinating, and the thing that reeled me in so completely, is this talent she has, that she discovers she has as an entrepreneur. So she grows up in an extremely modest set of circumstances, and when she wants to make something of her life, her father squashes her dreams, but she manages to make something of her life because she is a businesswoman. She's the kind of early prototype of a businesswoman. So can you tell us a little bit about that impulse in her and how it manifests?
Look, I'm not sure. Her ambition took the form of being a fantastic businesswoman, but I have a feeling it could have. The ambition that her father squashed in her was to be a school teacher. She was born in 1880. I should set the scene there a little. And in her day, there were 4 things that a woman could be. She could conceivably be a teacher. She could be a nurse if you could stand it. If you were Catholic, you could be a nun. But most women ended up simply wives, and they were the choices that she had. But when she left school at 14, as everybody did, she said to her father, "I want to be a pupil teacher. I want to train to be a teacher." And he said, "Over my dead body, any daughter of mine goes out to work," on the basis that it would shame him. People would think, "Oh, Tom Maunder can't support his family." So that was a wound that I think she carried with her all her life, and you can understand why, because the only other choice for her, she wasn't Catholic, was really to get married. So I think, she could have become a brilliant teacher. She could have become, the principal of a school. But she had intelligence and she had dynamism, and she was kind of fearless. And that took her in the direction of business.
Yes, she really was a risk taker. I just want to throw back to Elizabeth MacArthur for a moment, because in that book, In a Room Made of Leaves, we see Elizabeth MacArthur as the person who doesn't get the credit in history, but who you think deserves the credit for a lot of the success that is attributed to MacArthur as, the sheep farmer that Australia rode on the back of, as it were. So how do you see the thread, the link between Elizabeth MacArthur's initiative, her skill at breeding those sheep, her management of the properties during the long absences of her husband? Take me from Elizabeth to Molly.
Dolly, you mean?
Dolly, sorry.
That's okay. My next book is actually about a Molly, so you're kind of preempting me here. This is slightly spooky. Look, I think the straight line is that women, until really our generation, even perhaps beyond our generation, when I think of what, my choices when I was younger, our lives have been limited cruelly by the fact that we're born female. So, can you imagine our lives without, for example, contraception? Can you imagine our lives with the marriage bar, which said that any woman with a public service job had to give it up if she got married? That wasn't repealed until 1966. So that is the great thread that joins Elizabeth MacArthur and millions of others. One of the reasons I wrote this book about my grandmother was not just to atone for my incredible insensitivity as a 6-year-old, but also because my grandmother's story represents the story of hundreds of thousands of women like her from very, very humble backgrounds, sort of caught in that trap of being women at a time when it was a miserable thing to be born a woman, unless, of course, you were part of the top lot, in which case you had to sit around sort of dithering about which man to marry, which I suppose had its own hardships. So, we have had a rotten time. And, when I was in my 20s, I tried to get a mortgage to buy a house. I inherited a tiny bit of money. The bank manager would only do it if I pretended that my boyfriend and I were about to get married. That made it okay. We could have a mortgage. And for many years afterwards, in fact, every time I went into that particular branch of the bank, the manager would rush out, anxiously rubbing his hands together and say, "When's the happy day? When's the happy day?" So, that's my lifetime, that I couldn't get a mortgage on my own. So I think that's what joins them together. Yeah.
Do you ever look back, Kate, on your body of work? I wasn't really going to ask you this, but it's just suddenly occurred to me. I mean, when I think about B. Miles and the collection of women that you've written about, the sort of wayward women, the sort of outlier women that you've written about, I mean, B didn't come from impoverished circumstances. She came from privilege. And she resisted the expectations of that particular class and became this vagrant eccentric. So there's B, and then there's Elizabeth MacArthur. Do you look at those women and think, what are all the women that I've written about? What do they have in common? Or do you think that's the job of the critic and that's the job of sort of literary commentators, that you're not interested in looking back? Or do you group those women at all ever in your imagination?
No, not really. Each one sprang out of a different kind of question. I mean, the Elizabeth MacArthur book sprang out of the question. Elizabeth MacArthur left a lot of letters which are very, very bland. They're not super bland, because I have collected the less boring ones into a book, which, I don't want to kind of downplay it too much. But the thing about her letters is that they don't reflect what must have been the reality of her life, which was hard and difficult, and in a very tumultuous social context. So the question there was, what would that bit of history look like if all those letters were in fact fiction? What if she was making up this happy story about her life, and the real story, her real life, was committed to a secret manuscript which Kate Grenville somehow miraculously found 200 years later in an attic? So that was the fabulously interesting, and I loved writing that book, the question that got me into that book. So no, I don't. Each woman is, obviously her own person. When you say that, I see, yes, there is a body of work. But at the moment when I'm writing it, it's just this question, this puzzle. I think I would be very inhibited if I tried to think of anything else.
I guess, but there is, apart from the sort of reprise of your knowledge about sheep husbandry, I'm thinking that another thing that comes up in this book is that at one stage, and I'm jumping ahead in the narrative here, so it's a very messy way of doing things, but it's just occurring to me. At one stage, Dolly goes to visit some relatives who've married up and who are living sort of a better life, a life that is more educated and where there is more plenty. And I felt that in you describing those scenes, you were doing something that you had done before with Elizabeth MacArthur, was you were conjuring the spirit of Jane Austen. There was that sense of the sort of social pecking order and of noticing people with finer manners and who had better china on the table.
Yes, I think you're being unfair to Jane Austen. That's how I'd like to take you up on that. In the sense that I don't think she was, I mean, her books, as you would know, I'm sure, are about how false and imprisoning all that is. You know, so no, I'm sorry, I didn't quite mean that, but it sounded as if you might have taken Jane Austen at face value. I'm in awe of Jane Austen.
Well, that's why I thought that you were paying homage to her again. That's what I thought you were doing.
Yes, look, I am in that sense of irony. I'm sorry, I underestimated you. Which is not a good thing to do with you. So yeah, that sense that, because Jane Austen at the end of the 18th century, a century before Dolly, had no voice whatsoever. The only voice a woman had in those days was an ironic one. You could say, "Oh, I'm so happy," and you would know just by some magic. People who understood your life, other women, would hear the irony. I mean, that first sentence of Pride and Prejudice, it is well known that a man, blah, 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 blah. How do we know it's ironic? I've looked at that sentence so many times and thought, how do we immediately know that she's, you know, rolling her eyes? Anyway, that's another whole question. I think we women today, in my generation, are so lucky to be able to actually express ourselves in our own voices, whatever they are, however many voices an individual person has. Whereas Jane Austen could only write in that tiny little narrow thread of genre and is infinitely misunderstood, mainly because of the television and film things of all these, you know, romping in slow motion through the fields to meet Mr. Darcy. It wasn't like that at all. So I'm really sorry, I apologise.
No, that's completely fine. You mentioned before that marriage was one of the options, and obviously the most common option for most women as a sort of, you know, an escape from one family, but obviously into a kind of indentured labour in another family. But I just want to talk about the marriage at the centre of this book, because Dolly marries a philanderer, Bert. But what I think is so interesting about the way you characterise this marriage, and you do it very subtly and very glancingly, only a couple of times, is you let us know that when it comes to the bedroom, it's not as bad as she was expecting, that she quite likes it. And I was quite interested in your decision that for her, sex is not this awful shock to the system, because obviously she knows nothing about it. Before she gets to the bedroom, she can't have had any idea what to expect. But you say it's not really that bad of a thing.
Yes, it seemed like it would be an easy explanation for her crankiness to give her an unhappy sex life, basically. And I thought, I don't want to take that easy route, because there was much more to her crankiness than just the fact that she and her husband didn't get on in the bedroom, as you nicely put it.
But they do. They
get on well enough. Although it is interesting that they only had 3 children at a time when contraception was, which suggests either that, it could suggest all sorts of things. It could be down to Bert being rather good at, doing the only form of contraception at the time. I'm blushing here, but
But she does find out about a few little sponges and vinegar techniques.
She does when she moves to the city. Yes, something terrible called the housewife's friend, which was a foaming pill that you put up yourself. Can you imagine? So, look, she married well. She married a man who was the son of a single mother, as we would now say. His mother, in fact, was not just a single mother. She was either deserted or made a widow after she had 2 little girls. And she then had something like 8 more children year after year with no apparent man in view. So I have a feeling that in the little town of Carabubula, who knows what happened, but I can only say when I sent away for my grandfather's birth certificate, the terrible word illegitimate was scrawled diagonally across the page. And I then sent away for some of his brothers and sisters' birth certificates, and it was the same, illegitimate, and, you know, the column for father's name blank. So I can only imagine his mother's difficult life, but I think what that means is that he became a man who understood how hard the world was for a woman, particularly a single woman. And so that made him the relatively accepting and generous and non-misogynistic sort of man that I think he was. He was a philanderer. Well, you know, that seems to go with the territory of being a man, really. I don't kind of hold that against him. He was, you know, he didn't want to be found out. You know, he tried to keep it secret. So, I don't think badly of him for that.
And she has a few secrets of her own, which we won't divulge,
Yes.
which are for you to discover when you read the book. Let's go back to talking about her as a businesswoman, because what's so fascinating about her is the way she scales up. So she's never satisfied with what she's got. She goes from the farm to a shop to a boarding house to a pub to a bigger hotel. So she's always thinking about the next opportunity. That's the restlessness that the title refers to. So I wanted to ask you about what you think money represents to Dolly, and how does she manage money? How does she learn how to handle staff and run a business?
It's a very good question. I don't actually know. I know that money did not mean to her having nice things or, you know, spraying money around, spending it. It was actually the making of money that I think she was fascinated by, in the same way that other people are fascinated by finishing the Sudoku or writing a novel. It's something that you are driven to do because it's a challenge. It's quite difficult, and you want to try and do it. So she lived, I think, fairly modestly, even when they had money. But money was the medium of her freedom. At one point, when they had a big blow up because Bert had an affair with somebody, and she said to herself, I want to have financial independence. And Bert gave her that. He allowed her to have half the money, so that she went and bought a block of flats in Roslyn Gardens, I think it is, in King's Cross. Yes, if only we still had them. I have a feeling they're still there, actually. There's a rather posh... Anyway, so for her it was the key to freedom, money, because it meant that if Bert left her, she'd be okay, and she could also leave him, which is still... And of course, it's the freedom she gave her daughter. Now, my mother had a very difficult relationship with her mother because Grandma was a bully. My mother, oddly enough, wanted to be a teacher, like her mother, and weirdly, apparently Grandma said to her, over my dead body you will become a teacher. Now that Mum took that as a sign of how awful and perhaps slightly crazy Grandma was. The way I see it is, by then there were better options than teaching for a woman.
Oh.
And one of them was pharmacy, which is what she bullied my mother into becoming. And pharmacy allowed my mother freedoms that no other career probably would have offered her. Financial freedom with a husband who was a sort of slightly irregular earner, let's put it that way. And again, the joy of running a successful business. I mean, it must be amazing to be a shopkeeper. Dan, you would know, and have customers pouring into your shop and knowing that you are part of that fabulous give and take of supply and demand. You are the kind of oil in that thing. That must be so satisfying.
Yeah, that's so interesting. The same phrase. She utters that phrase, over my dead body, which was such a curse when it was uttered in her youth. Just thinking about the different businesses that she has, the shop, the pub, I wanted to ask you about the boarding house, because that's a particular kind of business that sort of disappeared from our landscape, but I mean, we can still see them in some streets. but they no longer really are part of the fabric of society. So can you just tell us a little bit about who the customers, who the clients would be who would come and stay at a boarding house?
Well, she had a particular kind of boarding house. There were the ones in the city where people lived who couldn't afford a whole flat on their own. You got a bedroom, but you also got meals. You got your dinner and maybe breakfast as well. But hers was at Newport, and it was a holiday boarding house. So it was, people would come up on the steamer from Sydney it was on the Pittwater side of Newport, if you know that geography. So the steamer would come up and, the people would all get off and spend the weekend at the beach at Newport. So it would have been a very cheerful place, I think, full of, I suspect, young couples and probably families. It would have been that kind of thing. And in those days, I suspect she was still pretty cheerful and would have, I've drawn her sort of scurrying around being one of those cheerful mine hosts, making people feel very special and cosseted and that kind of thing. I think she had a good grasp of human psychology. I think you have to be a good business person, actually, to know what will make people feel good, and that will make them come back with repeat business. How she learnt those things, though, is a good question, and I hadn't really thought about it. I suppose she made mistakes, that's the way most of us learn things. And of course, going from the farm, which failed, 7 years without a crop, was the family refrain, to a tiny grocery shop in Wahroonga, which was probably a good place to start, at very small scale, but you start to get used to having to please the customer. And from there, not a huge jump to a boarding house, and then from there, not an enormous jump to the Crown Hotel in Camden, which was it's still there actually, but a fairly small scale, not a grand hotel. And then gradually, as you say, 6 other hotels. They didn't own all of them. They bought and sold. And when I went to the New South Wales archives, pubs are beautifully archived. Other things you go looking for have been lost, but pubs, it's immaculate. You can see exactly who had the licence and for how long. And the Russells had the licence of each hotel for exactly a year. So there must have been some, capital gain advantage or something like that. So it was constantly moving. So that would have been one of the reasons why they moved, I think, some financial thing. And also, of course, to keep Bert from getting too close to any of the young women who were
Balmain
coming to help.
Yes. So have you done an event at the pub in Camden?
Hey, wouldn't that be great?
Yes! We'll come! That would be so fun. Because I have to say, one of the things that makes the marriage work is that they do have complementary skills, in that he also has that mine host, very good social manner. He likes to sort of serve the drinks with a flourish. He likes to have a bit of a chat with the ladies. The ladies think he's rather sort of handsome. So she becomes more sociable, doesn't she? With every step she makes, she finds that having been perceived as rather sort of frosty and aloof initially, she has got social skills. And in a sense, they develop with him, don't they?
Yes, look, that's very insightful. I hadn't actually realised that, but you're quite right. He was a very gregarious man, very confident in himself. Again, perhaps that background struggling, with his mother struggling so hard, gave him a kind of resilience and a confidence and a kind of nothing much to lose, let's not worry about it kind of quality, which she would have learned from him. You're right. He would have been terrific behind a bar. He drank a lot, but it never showed, apparently. At one stage in his life, he drank a bottle of scotch a day, my mother used to say. But he lived to 98, so very long with scotch.
Pickling is the way to go. So one of the things that is very poignant in the book, though, is that, she's successful. Dolly is successful. They are successful, and she moves from business to business, but she is somewhat alienated from her children. And I'm wondering, do you think that the reason for the alienation from her children is that she is ultimately more interested in the business or more taken up with the business than she is with them. What is the cause of the division? Is it the fact that they are able to have a better education and move out into the world in a way that she never could? Or is it that her priorities are elsewhere, or is it both of those things?
Look, I think it might be a bit of all of them, plus something else. I don't want to completely spoil one of the few bits of real kind of drama in the book, but there is a point just when she has had one child who's about 8 months old, and she discovers a very terrible betrayal, both by her husband and her mother. They have both betrayed her and kept a secret from her, which she should have known, should have been told. Now, her deep, deep wounding, that's the other great wound that she carries through her life. And I think because it had to do with the fact that she had just had this child, whom she loved, Frank, her oldest child, I think something curdled in her, something she thought, I mean, this rings true for me. You think, oh, I'm so happy. And then you kind of turn over a stone and some awful thing that you had not known about is there, and it somehow poisons everything. So I think her love for her oldest child was poisoned by that. And my mother was conceived, they separated, Bert and my grandmother separated because of that whole dreadful secret business. But at some point Dolly realised that she simply couldn't manage as a woman on her own with a little baby. There was just no way. They were on the farm at the time. No way a woman could manage, so she had to send a message and asked him to come back, which he did. And probably on that very night, my mother was conceived, she thinks. Apparently her father once said to her, "You were a fluke, Nance." Great. Great. Thanks, Dad. Thanks for coming with us. So those two children were conceived and born and grew up in the kind of poison of this terrible pain that had been committed on her. Now there's a third child, Max. He came along about 4 years later. Both parents adored Max. He was definitely the favourite, and I think it's because by then the pain of that betrayal had passed and Max was not tainted the way the other two were.
They had reached what Jane Austen would call an accommodation.
Yes, that's right.
One of the things that I love, though, that you give to Dolly, which gives her, I think, a lot of moxie and kind of strength, is she refuses shame and she refuses to take that sense of betrayal and humiliation and that woundedness out into the world. She has the moments of thinking, who knew what when, and I have been so completely taken for an idiot here. Yep. But she does reject shame, and shame was such a powerful stigma in society at the time. I mean, shame caused such stigma, and she sees all the divisions, for example, between the Catholics and the Protestants as absurd and hypocritical, and she just rejects anything that would take her down the route of shame.
Yes, that's quite true. That's very insightful. I hadn't thought of that. I've always thought that perhaps shame and some of those kind of delicate emotions are more perhaps belong more in the middle and upper classes, which are the classes, of course, which write novels, which contain those feelings. I just have a feeling that at the level of Dolly's family, there was kind of no great time, really, to muck around being shamed. And everybody around you probably had something to be ashamed about like that, because life was so difficult for all of them. So I have no way of proving that, but just instinctively I feel that there is a kind of freedom from a whole lot of expectations like that if you're sufficiently low down in the pecking order.
Interesting. I'm going to hand over to you in a moment. I'm sure that you're getting restless and you're itching to ask a question, and it is also very warm in here. Maybe we could open a window. But anyway, there is one other thing I wanted to ask you about, which is, at some point, does Dolly, or do Dolly and Bert have any kind of encounter with black fellas?
Look, they must have. Obviously, they must have. They were in Currabubilla near Tamworth, they went to Gunnedah, they went to Temora. you know, they were in the country. There's no way they would not have been surrounded by people of First Nations descent in various ways. Almost certainly there would have been people working for them on the farm, maybe in the pubs, but at no point in the family stories is there the faintest mention, the faintest acknowledgement that those people, they were absolutely made invisible. They were as if erased from that reality, which is why, and thank you for saying this, at the very end of the book I have put in a little acknowledgement that this story is one kind of story, it's the story I can tell, but standing beside it is another story of the taking of the land and the results of that for the people whose land it had been. That's not a story I can tell, but I very much wanted it to be clear that I know it's there. I haven't told this story ignorantly thinking that this is all there is.
Okay, but just on that point, Kate, I just want to press you on that a little bit. Why didn't you take the liberty of creating a fictional character that could have been part of Dolly and Bert's world?
A First Nations character. No, as in The Secret River, where I chose not to do that too. It just felt... Look, first of all, I was sure that I would not do it competently. I wouldn't do it convincingly. My lack of knowledge there is too great. Not that I don't know the history, I certainly know the history, or some of it. How it feels to be in that position, it would seem presumptuous, actually. I think maybe that's the word. It's not my story to tell, if that doesn't sound too...
No. I mean, it's
sacred.
It's very sensitive of you, and it is a sensitivity, and it's sort of hovering around the book. While you're reading it, you're thinking, surely there must have been black people in this landscape working on the farm or working in some capacity around here, but, you know, where are they? So they are there in a way as a presence, as a ghostly presence, I think, perhaps. Okay, so we have got now a comfortable, leisurely 15 minutes, which doesn't mean that you can ask a 15-minute long question. But if you've got a question for Kate, please ask it now. Otherwise, I will ask Kate to read something from the book, but we've got two questions straight away. The lady at the back, and then we'll come to the two on the side. Lady at the back first. And I'll repeat your question for the benefit of the viewers on Zoom. Okay, so are any of Dolly's children alive, and were you able to talk about them with Dolly, with your mother? Yes, sorry.
Okay, look, I knew two of my well, obviously my mother was one of Dolly's children, and I knew my Uncle Max, the younger one. Uncle Frank I never knew because he went to war and was one of the victims of the Burma Railway. The line, he was on the line, as they say. So, but I was infinitely blessed in my mother in 1,000 ways, and one of the many ways was that she left copious fragments of memoirs about her own life, but also about all the generations of my family back to the first convict, a man called Solomon Wiseman, who came out here in 1806, was sent out here in 1806. So Mum was fabulously ahead of her time in, first of all, not being ashamed of any of that, but also knowing that stories of those people, the bottom lot, if you like, very seldom reached a piece of paper. They were not recorded. She told me the stories orally, and of course I rolled my eyes like a rude teenager, but she also wrote them down, and I was just smart enough to stick a tape recorder in front of her and get her to tell me them again. So she told me a great deal about her growing up. So that's how I know what I know about Dolly. All the events in this book are from life. It's a novel because I had to make up the person to whom they happened.
You're lucky that you had a mother who didn't freeze when you put a tape recorder in front of her, because a lot of mothers don't like tape recorders. I'm speaking from experience. Yeah, there was a question over there. Yeah.
And it resonated a lot with what you were saying. Can you tell me the relationship between this book and the
Okay, so that's a question about an Audible book in which features a story by Kate called Always Greener, and you want to know about the relationship between that story and this book.
Good question. Look, in the middle of COVID, it was suggested, Audible was commissioning short books, really a series of podcasts, as you would know, not an adaptation of a novel, but a kind of standalone oral thing to be read by the author. And my fabulous agent put forward the idea of my grandmother's story, which she had known a little bit about because of the story that I had published about my mother. So I did that. It was a fabulous job to do in COVID. Now that's 10 little episodes of a podcast. It's a kind of small-scale prototype, in a way, of this novel, and it shows Dolly in a very. When I went to rewrite it as a novel, a book, I realised that my thinking had shifted quite a lot. The Audible book is called Always Greener because I felt that Dolly was. I think I hadn't quite understood why she was so restless. So that's rather dismissive. Distant fields are always greener. I rather dismissed her like that. In writing this book, where I had much more elbow room, it's twice as long, I could burrow down and understand her in a very different way, and her restlessness now has a much more subtle and I think interesting dimension. If you've read both, I would be interested to know what you feel about them. But that's the history of that.
That lady there, yeah.
I'm curious to know what your mother said to you when you said you wanted to be a writer.
Okay, so the question was, what did your mother say to you when you said you wanted to be a writer? Was it over my dead body?
On the contrary, she was absolutely thrilled. I didn't always want to be. Well, I didn't ever say that to her. But when it turned out that I was becoming a writer, there were tears in her eyes of pride and pleasure because her own life had been transformed by great literature. At any moment in her life, she would have a bit of Shakespeare or Keats or Shelley to quote. She had an amazing memory and she could quote a whole great burst of stuff, absolutely, relevant to the moment. So the fact that I was going to join, in my own tiny, impoverished way, that great pantheon of writers was for her the greatest. It's probably the only good thing I really did for my mother. I wasn't a terribly good daughter, but I did do that.
Another question. Ooh. Do you have another one? I wanted to ask you something else. There's a lovely kind of thing where, having had the role model in a way of the young teacher that she wants to emulate at the beginning of her life, and her father prevents her. Later in life, Dolly meets a woman who is a spinster and who is very fulfilled in her life. And as a result of that encounter, Dolly acquires another skill on top of her business acumen. She acquires this, I suppose, what we would now call aptitude for networking. And it's just a beautiful kind of coda, in a way, to the story of the young teacher at the beginning of the story. So I was just wondering whether you could talk about the figure of the spinster and who she's based on.
Yes, the figure of the spinster, usually in 19th century literature, is a figure of pity, basically a pitiable old person, as she is always in Jane Austen. It's why those women had to get married. My mother had said that when the family lived in Temora, her brother was boarded with someone that she described as the local photographer. So, because I love, I'm a research nerd. So I went to Temora, of course, and I thumbed through the Temora newspaper, whatever it's called, and in that I found probably the woman that Mum was talking about. She did take the photographs, but she also wrote. She was a bit of a journalist. She wrote some of the stories. I can't now remember her real name because I've changed it so many times to kind of conceal her in the book, but she was a real figure. And I thought a lot about her, and I thought, well, she must have, in order to have learned photography and learned to be a journalist, she was obviously a woman of education and therefore a degree of privilege. So that was the figure around which I built, whoever I've called her, in this book, which is a woman with, well-spoken vowels, that kind of person. And above all, a sense of confidence. Unlike any other spinster Dolly had met, she felt that she had a right to be in the world. And the reason she felt that was that she had the skills to take her place alongside men, doing something that men did, being journalists and photographers. So it was, yes, a fabulous role model for Dolly, and whoever that woman really was, she probably was, in fact, a great role model for the young girls of tomorrow.
Yeah, what a gift to you as well to find her.
Yeah.
This is where the research of scouring the local paper really does pay off.
Look, there are hours of pointlessness, and you think, what on earth am I doing here in this stuffy little room in Temora, turning these ancient pages? And then there's something.
Gold.
You often don't know quite that it's gold at the moment, but there's always some. It's like it's illuminated on the page. And you think, I can't see quite why that's important, but I'm going to believe my instinct that it is.
So can you just tell us technically what you do at that point? Do you take a photocopy of the column? Do you make a couple of notes? What do you do? What folder does that go into?
Look, it would go into another one, which would be called notes. And almost certainly it would have been scribbled on the back of an envelope, because I'm seldom organised enough to even have a notebook, and I'm not sure I had a camera. I mean, this is a while ago now. So it goes into a folder, and after a while there's a nice thickness of old envelopes in that folder. Woolies receipts are excellent for writing a little note on the back of. And at a certain point I sit down, and it's a glorious moment when I sit down and type them all into the computer in just the order they're in the folder. And then, this is because of my film editor training. It's what a film editor taught me how to do when you edit a documentary. You just put it all in a line and look at it. And at that point you allow it to suggest where is the energy? Which bits of this are energetic? You're not thinking structure or anything. You're just thinking energy. And from then on, that's such an exciting moment when you first read all of those things, and it's chaos. Obviously, it's meaningless. But there are things at that point. I read it, what I think of as the virgin read, not stopping to think. But in the margin, I write, no good, good, perhaps usable, that kind of thing. And I don't quite know why, but it's just, okay, this bit's got legs, and this bit hasn't got legs.
That only works if you've got the Kate Grenville brain. That's the trouble. We've come to the end of the session nearly, but I just wondered whether you might finish by reading something to us from the book, just to give us a taste of your beautiful prose.
Okay, look, I'll just read a little bit from the very beginning, because this is where Dolly began. When I asked that question, why was my grandmother so cranky? It's 3 minutes. Have we got 3 minutes?
Yes.
Okay, always. 1881. Currabubula, New South Wales. As soon as she could walk, she knew she wanted to be outside, moving. The house was too dark, too small, smelling of stale wood smoke and dogs. It was outside she wanted, the horizon shaped by the perfect cone of Durai Mountain on one side and the high, ragged outcrop of Terrible Billy on the other. Outside and moving around, the sky above you and the dirt under your feet, and always the shape of the land against the sky, like a familiar face. They were 6 miles out of Currabubula on the farm. Currabubula itself was only 3 dusty streets and a pub. She was 5 before she saw a town. Tamworth was 20 miles away, and the Maunders didn't have much call to go there. Dolly could see that her mother's life was just a lot of hard work. There wasn't anything gentle in her voice, except when she went through the family story, telling over where she came from, where everyone fitted together, as if all the raggedness in her life could be knitted up into that laying out of the generations. Mostly, she never saw her mother smile, only go about the endless tasks, banging open the stove door to throw in more wood and clanging it shut as if to punish it. Her father, Thomas Maunder, had been brought out from London as a poor Cockney boy to work on the huge sheep run near Curra called Gunnaganoo. It gave him special bitter satisfaction to go over and over the stories of his humiliations there. He told over the hurts like jewels, turning them in his memory so they flashed with his anger. But he'd worked hard, boasted that in his younger days he'd held the shearing record in the area, 222 sheep in a single day with the blades. And finally he bought his own place, Forest Farm, where Dolly grew up. She never saw anything soft in her father. When he came in from the paddocks, he filled the kitchen, massive, solid, a great rock. Sat at the head of the table, his big rough hands flat on the wood, waiting for his tea to be put down in front of him, and woe betide if it wasn't ready when he was. They were all frightened of their father and his belt with the big brass buckle. The house was small. Everyone around the table in the kitchen could hear it from the front room, that slap of leather on skin. Now and again, though, at the end of a long day of shearing or getting the hay in, there'd be moments of rough warmth between the father and his sons. They'd all gone together at some mountain of work and beaten it, and one of them would say something over the stew that made the others laugh, something that had happened in the shearing shed. But it was only for the pleasure of the men. They weren't going to explain the joke to the women. Girls were of no account. You learned that early on. Good enough to make the bread and milk the cow, and later on you'd look after the children. But no woman was ever going to be part of the real business of the world. So that's where she started.
Thank you very much for sharing Dolly with us, and I think it's wonderful that you've been able to atone for that harsh answer in such a magnificently loving and imaginative way. Will you please join me in thanking Kate Grenville? Thank you very much.